For most of human history, the person who held the knowledge held the power. Not influence, not charisma, not a better product or better pitch, knowledge specifically. The village elder who knew which plants would kill you and which would cure you. The priests who could read the text the congregation could not access. The lawyer who understood the language the court spoke. The doctor who studied for a decade to understand the body you live in but can't read. Even that guy in the record store who understood which B-side was essential was a minor deity in 1994. Basically, the original pay me or die in ignorance subscription model. These weren't just professions, they were gatekeeping positions. And the gate they held access to was information that was genuinely structurally scarce. You couldn't get it without them. Now, that wasn't arrogance, that was the architecture of how knowledge moved through the world. You might have built your career on the same architecture. The expert in the room, the people defer to. The one who gets called because they know things the others don't. The one who says, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and hopes no one asks follow-up questions. For most of human history, that was the most rational strategy available. That architecture is now gone, and it was always going if you were paying attention. In 1975, a Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson built the first digital camera. It weighed 3.6 kilograms and produced an image at 0.01 megapixels. It took 23 seconds to record a single photograph to a cassette tape. Sasson took it to Kodak's management. Their response, according to Sasson himself, was, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." Which, to be fair, is exactly what you'd say if you'd been handed a loaded weapon pointed at your own face and needed a moment to think. Translation: nice try, kid. Now go back to the darkroom and pretend it never happened. They put it in a drawer, probably next to the recipe for New Coke and the instructions for how to properly rewind a VHS tape. They had the knowledge, they just decided to treat it like a cursed artifact from an Indiana Jones movie. They weren't stupid. They were trying to protect a business that owned 90% of the American photographic film market and 85% of the camera market. The entire revenue model depended on one thing: that people wouldn't have access to technology that would make the entire film market irrelevant. So when their own engineer invented that technology, they put it in a drawer. They had the knowledge, they invented the tool, and they consciously decided to sit on it because their entire position depended on the barrier staying in place. In 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. The barrier didn't hold. It never does. That's the pattern. And the pattern is older than Kodak by about 500 years. In 1440, Jonas Gutenberg ran the first movable type printing press in Mainz. Within 50 years, the number of books in Europe went from around 30,000 to 9 million. The scribe, who'd held the position of genuine structural power, because literacy was so rare that controlling access to the written word was controlling access to the law, commerce, and history, suddenly found himself with a very expensive quill and a lot of free time. He updated his job description. Formerly important, now available for calligraphy gigs and Renaissance Fair appearances. Jump in your DeLorean and enter 1969 into the destination, and you can witness the birth of the internet, a project called ARPANET, developed by the US Department of Defense. Then, after watching the moon landing, attending Woodstock, witnessing the jumbo jet take off, and then relaxing to enjoy the first episode of Sesame Street, chuck some more plutonium in the flux capacitor and blast forward to 1991 and watch Tim Berners-Lee introduce the World Wide Web. And yes, for you millennials and younger, we really did say www before every internet address. By the mid-90s, primary sources of information became universally accessible. Anyone could reach an audience of millions from a spare room. The academic gatekeeper started to lose the gate. But here's the thing the internet didn't kill, and this matters because most people assumed it would: the expert. The lawyer with a LinkedIn following of 40,000 still charged $500 an hour, possibly more because Now you've heard of him. You could reach 1 million people from your bedroom, yet you still couldn't draft a contract or argue a legal case without paying someone who'd studied 7 years to do it for you. The output still required a credential. Because as it turns out, reading a Wikipedia thread on constitutional law at 2 a.m. doesn't in fact make you Denny Crane. Game shows showed how much we valued someone with knowledge. For decades, Jeopardy was the highest public expression of what society considered intelligence. Sale of the century. Who wants to be a millionaire? Mastermind. The entire format rested on a single premise. The person who could recall the most, the fastest, was the smartest person in the room. And the audience didn't just watch it, they celebrated it, because the format reflected something society genuinely believed. Knowledge was the achievement. We treated people who knew the capital of Uzbekistan like they were Nobel laureates, rather than a very specific, very useless power at pub quiz. Warning, the next part is a little disappointing because while I'd like to throw some banana peels and soda in the back of the DeLorean, the future from back then is a little bleak. Instead of ending up with flying cars and hoverboards, today we have people photographing every meal, a reboot of every Disney movie, and the perpetually offended getting angry online daily. And you wonder why my phone lives on silent. But if you have the courage, jump back into the Wayback Machine and come forward to 2026. Put the Jeopardy champion on stage against an audience with smartphones. Champion, what's the capital of Assyria? Audience member, without even looking up from their phone, Assur. Next. The format didn't change. The thing that it was measuring, the recall of scarce information, stopped being scarce. Suddenly, the smartest person in the room was the one with the best signal, or the one that knew how to Google without the teacher noticing. What happened next in the entertainment industry is worth noting because television tracks cultural shifts faster than most institutions. The formats that grew weren't quiz shows. They were MasterChef, The Apprentice, yes, that one, The Block, Survivor. You don't win those by knowing. You win by building, deciding, adapting under pressure, and executing when everything's on the line and there's no script to follow. And not burning the souffle while everyone watches. Turns out society voted with its remote. We'd rather watch someone cry over a bad risotto than watch someone recite the periodic table. The entertainment industry tracked the value shift before most boardrooms did, where you're sitting right now. The medical question you used to wait 3 weeks to get an appointment to ask is now answered in 90 seconds. Of course, it also tells you your mild headache is a rare tropical disease only found in the Amazon, but the boffins continue to work on the filters. The legal research that a junior associate took a full week to prepare, including some very impressive looking highlighting, now runs in 4 minutes with the right tools. The financial model that required a trained analyst from an investment bank now runs in an afternoon if you ask the right questions. Suddenly, your expensive expert is now competing with a chatbot that never sleeps, never bills in 6-minute increments, doesn't judge your personal search history, or the fact that you're still in your pajamas on a Zoom call pretending that the camera doesn't work. The barrier is gone. The part of the professional's position that was built on scarcity of information, that part is gone. What remains is everything that was always replaceable and always will be. The judgment about which question is worth asking, the relationship that makes the answer land, and the courage to act when the answer is uncomfortable. This is the doer's position, which raises the question most people aren't asking, not because it's difficult, but because the answer is confronting. If the knowledge barrier is gone, what are you building your identity around? Be honest. For some of us, it's still, I went to law school, therefore I am. Even while the AI just drafted a better contract in 47 seconds while humming the Jeopardy theme. In my book, I come back to one argument in it consistently, and it's this. Across every case study in the book, the gap between having the knowledge and acting on it was never an information problem. It was always emotional. It was always structural. The organizations that failed had access to the same data as the ones that succeeded. Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975. They had the knowledge, they had the technology. What they lacked was the identity of a company willing to act on what they knew, because acting on it meant dismantling what they'd already built. Classic case of corporate identity crisis. We're a film company, said the people holding the very technology that made film obsolete. That's not a technology story, that's an oops story. And identity, the decision about who you are and what you can do with the information you access, that's not something you discover, that's something you declare. The doer isn't the person who knows more, they're just the person who eventually got tired of researching. Like the YouTuber who's never owned a car before that uses his ad revenue to buy a car that would be considered a midlife crisis later on. He spends all weekend studying forums about torque curves and active inlet valves and which exhaust will make his Porsche sound angrier. He eventually realizes that the only way to know is to stop faffing around on the internet and actually put his foot down, even if it is electric and sounds like a disappointed hairdryer. That decision doesn't require a decade of training. It doesn't require a credential. It requires telling that voice in your head to shut up and flooring it. He finally made a choice and acted. The Noah's gatekeeper was always temporary. The doer was always the end game. I'm Damien Andrews at Peterson's Lookout in Tyers in Latrobe City. The gorge here behind me is 140 million years old. The explanation for what you're looking at was always there, it was always true, it was always accurate. What changed was your ability to access it, standing right where you're standing now. Phone in hand, no expert required. Go do something with that, or read one more article about it. That should help. And remember, the quality of thinking you bring to AI determines everything.